As already noted, my name is Carolina Peterson, and my book, The Effortless Perfection Myth, came out a little over a year ago. Unsurprisingly, a great deal of my work focuses on this notion of effortless perfection, which is a term that was coined at my alma mater, Duke, back in 2003. It's basically this expectation that you're supposed to have the perfect grades, perfect body, perfect social life, perfect future plans, but of course, it's not really supposed to look like it takes any visible effort. And it's kind of interesting because I also have a lot of parents who read my book and say, I thought I was reading this for my kid, but actually this is really applicable to parenting. It never really stops. And I was like, yes, unfortunately, unless we address it early. So the term effortless perfection has since been used to describe the cultural climate on campuses really all across the US, and it even has a couple of different names that it goes by. So at Stanford, it's known as duck syndrome, which kind of paints this picture of a serene pond where ducks are gliding across the surface, but underneath, they're paddling like crazy trying to get where they want to go. At University of Pennsylvania, it is referred to as pen face, which kind of implies that every day before you leave your dorm room, you have to put on this mask of stoic strength and do a lot of posturing that you've never experienced anything but success. And you can't really take that off until you're back again in your dorm room alone at the end of the night. So regardless of all the various names that have been used to describe this phenomenon, my research shows that it tends to create these environments where we're so set on making it seem like we have everything put together at all points in time that when we do inevitably run into struggle, we look around at our seemingly flawless peers and really assume, oh, it's just me. I'm the only one struggling. And as a result, we're a lot less willing to ask for help, lest we be labeled, the one who couldn't keep up. And so the consequences of the issues with which we're dealing become much more intense and dangerous than they might otherwise have been if we had, sought a little group commiseration. This issue is one that particularly hits home for me. In high school, much like probably many of your children, I was identified as a high achiever through various awards and lofty expectations. So I went off to college fully expecting that I was on this ultimate path to success. I had my golden ticket. All I had to do was cash it in. While I definitely experienced many of my highest highs during my college years, really too many to count, I also was surprised to experience many of my lowest lows. So, to get a little personal, my sophomore year, I was diagnosed with an eating disorder. My junior year, I had a string of panic attacks. And my senior year, I fell into a major depressive episode. So, if I was supposed to be this gleaming example of someone who made it, much like many of those back at home assumed, and probably many of those around me on campus also assumed, something was definitely wrong, especially because I knew it wasn't just me. These were issues I was seeing my peers struggle with, my friends, those that I mentored, really just the same. And I think that many of us were approaching school and all that was meant to come after as this kind of mental toughness challenge. Personally, I gave myself a lot of tough love when what I needed was to be gentler with myself, a little less strict, a little less rigid, and I think again, your children might be able to identify with this, I felt like I had been given so much opportunity, and that showing my gratitude for that was about proving, I wasn't going to let any of these privileges I had been afforded go to waste. And so in a way, achieving things and making my community and my family proud really began to feel like almost this kind of moral obligation, especially in high school. And I've since met a number of kindred spirits who felt this way for a variety of different reasons. I think this particularly applies when I was speaking with first-generation college students and children of immigrants. So a lot of them were worried about being seen as ungrateful if, despite the sacrifices their parents and their grandparents had painstakingly made on their behalf, they still admitted that, yeah, sometimes I struggle, or sometimes, things are painful. And I think, particularly I had an interviewee who I talked to about this, and she was talking about how her sophomore year she came home from college, and she told her parents that she thought she might be clinically depressed. And her parents had come to the United States as refugees. So it didn't really click for them. And they looked at her and they were like, here's our daughter with access to resources beyond our wildest dreams, but she's depressed. They couldn't really put herself in the shoes of navigating a new environment and those pressures and all of that. And so they ended up telling her, depression is kind of just like a rich people issue or a white people issue. And it really kind of condensed the shame that she felt around this condition. When writing my book, I interviewed female-identifying individuals of different races, sexualities, socioeconomic statuses at 15-plus institutions of higher learning across the U.S. Of course, I think that much of this material is applicable to those all across the gender spectrum. But in terms of the schools that I interviewed at, it was small private liberal arts colleges like Colgate, and large public colleges, universities like the University of Alabama. And I noticed a trend among a lot of my interviewees where they kind of seemed to be worried about being asked things like, your life looks so good on the outside, you go to this top school, you come from a good family, you have access to so much, how can you possibly be anxious or depressed? And again, there was this shame of feeling like whatever they were going through wasn't bad enough to be feeling the way they were feeling. There was a definite fear of being labeled weak, shallow, unappreciative, or attention-seeking to ask for anything less than the worst-case scenario. And so mental health became this really odd kind of contest when it shouldn't be, right? Pain is pain and hurt is hurt, and it's not a competition. But they had a really hard time applying that to themselves. They could see it for others, but they didn't have the same level of empathy for their own issues. Everyone loves the self-sufficient child who makes their parents proud as they earn good grades and bring home various awards. A lot of people don't recognize the harmful mindset that sometimes goes into delivering this persona. So frequently, the self-motivated golden boy or good girl who's become quite skilled at meeting and surpassing those expectations does so because they've really internalized this idea that they're most valuable and thus most lovable when living up to this impossible standard of effortless perfection. I told your kids this today, but personally, I, especially in high school, thought that my parents really needed me to be the kid that they never had to worry about. I had 2 younger brothers. They required a little more attention. So, I thought, I'll just make my parents' job a little bit easier, not have to be asked to do my homework, not get in trouble, do all those things that signal that I am a healthy, happy, well-adjusted kid. And it was easy because for the most part I was, right? But I did hit a point in college where I had no choice but to reach out to my parents and say, I think I need help. I think I need one of you to come down here. And after that experience, I realized just how much I had misjudged my parents' strength and their willingness to be there for me as a complex individual with her own trials and tribulations. And I just realized I did not give them nearly enough credit. And our relationship really, I think, went to a next level as a result. Perfectionism in general, I I think sometimes we hear this term and we're like, that's just a superficial cliche. That's all about upholding flawless appearances. There's a lot more to this concept. So effortless perfection, perfectionism in general, it's not narcissism, it's not a competitive need to prove you're the best. It's actually a maladaptive coping mechanism used by those of us who struggle with anxiety and trauma and people-pleasing tendencies to really numb those uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. So there's this huge mental health component that often gets left out or forgotten entirely. I also think it's important to note that perfectionism can look different for different people because the expectations that we place on ourselves and the expectations that we receive from our environments often differ according to identity markers like race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status. So when I was interviewing different individuals, I found LGBTQ students tended to equate perfection with less homophobia. Checking certain boxes by appearing conventionally attractive, smart, athletic, popular, that was their winning strategy for getting the world to maybe go just that much easier on them. They felt like, okay, I can't conform in these ways, but I can conform in other ways. For students of color, I found that particularly in predominantly white spaces, as unfortunately a lot of private schools and elite institutions tend to be, although Durham Academy seems to be a little better than most schools I've visited, I will give you credit for that. But I have found that in those environments, students of color are pursuing effortless perfection often because they feel like there's more eyes on them. They're not representative of themselves as individuals, they feel representative of their entire race. So some are, feeling the need to feed into these respectability politics by disproving unfair, negative stereotypes about their race. Or some may feel pushed by the model minority myth, which really demands perfection as a kind of default setting and shames underperformance of any kind. I also think that this can look different based on gender. So, I had a lot of female identifying students who tended to think it's not enough to just be really good at one thing. I have to be valedictorian and homecoming queen and MVP, and I have to do all those things very well. Whereas male identifying students were more likely to be okay with building an entire identity out of being like the soccer star or the math genius. And what I found difficult here was for a lot of young men, when they run into some sort of a road bump, whether it be an injury or some other form of a setback, there's kind of a void left where they are questioning themselves, who am I? Or, what was all this for? I also think that for male students, there is a different sense of what counts as successful. It's a little more narrow in terms of what they feel they're allowed to pursue in terms of career goals. And it's actually one space where we allow our female students a little bit more leniency, which I think is interesting. Whatever the reason, effortless perfection typically links back to a desire for control over our environments and ourselves. So there's sort of this idea that if I can make my life look perfect on the outside, it will start to feel perfect on the inside. In a flawless state, things won't be able to hurt me. And I also hate to say it, I don't know if anybody here identifies as a recovering perfectionist, but I certainly do. And perfectionism is unfortunately sometimes accompanied by this sense of entitlement. I've worked so hard, I've sacrificed so much, I deserve a break from hardship. And I think in part because of this attitude, we make ourselves more fragile, less resilient, less prepared to handle adversity. So, for instance, when I had my depressive episode at Duke, my dad came and I remember having this conversation with him where I just said over and over again, this wasn't supposed to happen to me. And he very kindly, but also very straightforward, said, this isn't supposed to happen to anybody. You know, what makes you so special? And I was like, you know, I felt that. So, with this in mind, there's a quotation by an acclaimed pastor, Maurice Boyd, that really hits home for me, in which he says, at the world-renowned Waterford Crystal, each piece of crystal is meticulously inspected, held up to the light. Each surface appraised for the slightest crack or deformity. If any is spotted, the piece is immediately shattered for a defect nearly invisible to the human eye. Notice how close perfection is to despair. I think it's a really powerful parallel to think about when the opposite of perfection is obliteration. It makes sense to feel like everything is constantly at stake. And as a somewhat recent college graduate and someone who has been teaching middle and high school for the past 5 years, I venture to say that this is how a lot of our students feel on a somewhat regular basis. So, that was a lot of information. What do we do with all this? We've talked about what effortless perfection is, how it functions, how it impacts different people in different ways, how it's correlated with negative mental health. What are some of the signs that it's maybe managed to wriggle itself into the lives of our children, or dare I say, ourselves? There's 3 main warning signs that come to mind for me and that I talk about in my book. The first is reassurance addiction. So does your child crave external validation to an unhealthy extent? Reassurance addictions really function by causing individuals to stop trusting their own personal judgment when it comes to their worth. So things like grades, weight on a scale, other forms of numerical proof, they become a really, really major fixation. So what's a parenting tip here? From this, I'm going to pull on some of the advice by clinical psychologist Lisa Damour, who also has a couple of best-selling books to her name. She recommends we stop praising inefficient overwork, even if it results in good grades. What do we mean by this? Say I have a student, and I'm going to give you a real-life example, okay? In middle school, I have a student. They come into my classroom. They say, Ms. Peterson, I was up until 3 a.m. last night working on the final project for your class because I just wanted it to be perfect. And she's ready for me to lay on the praise. And I kind of had to pause and think about how to respond. And I said, I really admire your persistence. Your effort is important. I also really care about your sleep. You know, let's think about how you might have maybe been more tactical or energy efficient in your approach to this project. You know, were the last 2 hours really necessary, or, you know, did you only really get marginal returns? And the reason I'm saying this is not to criticize, but I have found from personal experience that continuing to be a good student in the long term is about actively guarding against burnout. And I want to give you permission to do that. And I think a lot of kids, they kind of need to hear that from these authority figures in their life because they want that praise really, really badly. I found that some students have a hard time letting go of this because in a way it's their coping mechanism, it's their sense of control. And I found that if you frame it in a particular way, they start listening a little closer. So if you frame inefficient overwork as lacking the self-regulatory skills that signal when to disengage, they're listening a little more. The other reason I bring this up is because I think for parents, there's more important stuff going on here. So the compulsive and excessive need to prepare and overfunction can lead to other addictions later in life. We saw that in some of the research that I went over earlier, where it can lead to other addictions like drinking and drug problems, and a lot of that is out of an effort to really calm that compulsion to achieve. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a personal story about one of my friends from college. Many would say that he was the ideal Duke student. He was very attractive and charming. He was social chair of his fraternity, 4.0 in econ major, everything going for him, right? And yes, very impressive, but as we started hanging out more and I got to know him more as a friend, I started noticing some other stuff going on there. One being that pretty much every day he was taking really large doses of Adderall to be able to deliver on those good grades and still have the energy left over to go to the gym and do all the various exercises that a six-pack requires. I also noticed that at night he pretty much always was smoking pot in order to be able to calm himself down enough to just be able to fall asleep. And on nights where he was going out, which was often, he was pretty much always drinking until he was blackout. It was pretty common for him to be asked to leave a bar. There was a worry at one point that he, might be asked to leave Duke because these incidents of underage drinking kind of kept stacking up. And there was one night where, he just kind of broke down crying and said to me, I don't know how to be vulnerable. I don't know how to do it. And he just kind of kept repeating that. And it was made really clear to me that this was, this golden boy, this oldest son in his family, and he'd never really been allowed to lay that burden down. And I think when we think about effortless perfection, we think a lot about young women, but I think we should also definitely be thinking about young men. I also think it's important as parents to recognize that it's really easy to overlook the child or the friend who, by all outside measures, is absolutely kicking butt. I think sometimes we look at our students and we're like, well, they have straight A's, so they're good. And, sometimes there's a little more going on beneath the surface. All right. My second warning sign that I want you all to think about is inflexible all or nothing thinking. So does your child have just one vision of what success looks like and have a really hard time accepting alternative approaches to achieving their goals? This inflexible thinking makes them really prone to anxiety because situations involving uncertainty can quickly become overwhelming and possibly even destabilizing. It's a little corny, but I'm teaching a class at Middlebury College right now called Effortless Perfection, Mental Health, and the Female Collegiate Experience. I actually have a Durham Academy alumna in my class. She's amazing, of course. All of my students are. And one of the things that I had them do was a failure resume, which sounds a little counterintuitive, but here's why. I wanted them to think about what are the setbacks that I've had that have been part of my journey, and what was the lesson? And how was maybe this lesson that I learned actually really important to my long-term success? I also was lucky enough that the college president and also the head coach of the female field hockey team, who has had 3 national championships in a row, wins in D3, and they've only lost 1 game in 3 seasons. Maybe a little bit of effortless perfection going on there. And I asked these 2 very strong, powerful women, would you also be willing to do a failure resume for me? Because I think it's important for young people to see how those that they really idolize or they see as having it all also have struggles and failures, and how, if I have struggles and failures, it doesn't actually bar me from getting to where they are because they too are human. And I think that humanizing the people we idolize can actually be really helpful, particularly in feminism. There's sort of this expectation that, it's all about the woman who has it all. It's all about being the Wonder Woman. And I think that what we actually need a little bit more of is giving people permission to be more real. I think that's really, really helpful for today's young students. So it's a little corny, but I gave them this certificate of failure, and you would be surprised, there are senior girls in college who have tacked this up on their desk because they need permission to mess up sometimes. Confession, this was not an idea of my own. I got this from Rachel Simmons, who's a best-selling author. She wrote Odd Girl Out, and she just came out with a book called Enough as She Is. So, certificate of failure. All right, last one, fear-based motivation. Is your child fueled by anxiety instead of passion and intellectual curiosity? Do they view success as an experience or as an identity? Because if they view it as an identity, they are going to be driven by this fear that it's one that they're constantly about to lose. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be using their time at Durham Academy to stretch their minds and their body, like their capabilities and their abilities, right? What I am saying is that it is important to think about the kinds of trade-offs that you're making in the meantime. An Ivy League acceptance is not worth your sanity. And I'm not saying that facetiously. I was recently speaking at Harvard, and I had a young woman who said, sometimes it feels like this is a really hard place to be, but it's a great place to be from. So, yeah. Life is not supposed to feel like a never-ending boot camp. Accomplishment is not a cure-all. Make sure your kids know that. All right, I want you to think, I'm going to give you a little something you have to know, about all the things you love about your child or children, all of them. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. All right, how many of the things that you were just thinking about, the best parts of your kiddos, are things that go on a resume or a college application? I'm going to assume probably not many of them. I think it's important to celebrate our children's accomplishments when it comes to athletics, when it comes to grades. I also think that it's important that we celebrate their kindness and their gentleness and their humor and their emotional intelligence. And I think that a lot of times it's very easy for young people to confuse praise and love, and to think that I only get love when I deliver A's or when I come within close proximity of perfection. And I know that you as parents are listening to me say that, and you're like, oh, come on. Like, I tell them all the time, I just want them to be happy, or I want this, or I want that. But I do think that it's something that helps to kind of reiterate. All in all, my biggest piece of advice, as a non-parent, but I'm going to tell you all how you should be parenting, is it really helps to open lines of communication as opposed to forcing some grand intervention. Right? Plant those seeds showing that you're a safe space to share and unload. I had a dad who was looking for a way to build on his relationship with his daughter who was in college. So he read my book. And he told me that he took a picture of a passage on a certain page that he thought was particularly poignant, and he texted it to her, and he said, you don't have to respond, but I was reading this, and it made me think of you, and if you ever want to talk about this, I'm here. That's all. I think we need to give ourselves grace as parents that, like, it's not all going to work out perfectly. This perfectionism thing also applies to parenting. But it's very easy to overlook your child who is self-sufficient, who maybe has subconsciously decided that as the non-squeaky wheel, they have to hide their hard emotions or their difficult experiences from their parents. And they may need a reminder, as my parents once gave me, that being there for them and loving them through whatever it is they are going through is part of the parenting job description. And they, as the child, do not get to decide what you, as the parent, are strong enough to handle. My hope for you all is that by knowing some of these mental health pressures and how they're showing up in today's day and age, looking out for some of those signs I talked about, that when your child does choose to come forward and talk to you, you already be a couple of steps ahead of them. I think they still really need you in ways that they maybe aren't willing to admit. but I think you all are up for the challenge. And with that, I thank you all for being here tonight.